Imagine a city block where 50,000 people live. Not a neighborhood, not a district. A single block, 12 stories high. No government, no building codes, no sunlight reaching the lower floors. Dentists operating without licenses next to heroin dens. Children playing on rooftops because there's nowhere else to go. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. This was Kowloon walled city, the most densely populated place in human history. A vertical slum that became a vertical civilization. And its story challenges everything we think we know about how cities should function. Today it's gone. Demolished in 1993. Replaced by a park with a few memorial plaques. But for almost 50 years, it stood as living proof that human beings can organize themselves in ways that urban planners never imagined. Let me take you inside. The origins of Kowloon walled city go back to Imperial China. In the 1800s, it was a small military outpost. A fort, really. When Britain took control of Hong Kong in 1898, they negotiated a 99-year lease on the surrounding territories. But the walled city itself remained technically Chinese. This created a legal anomaly. A tiny patch of Chinese sovereignty surrounded by British Hong Kong. Neither government wanted to deal with it. China couldn't access it. Britain didn't want to provoke a diplomatic incident by claiming it. So the walled city became a no-man's land. And people started moving in. At first, it was refugees. People fleeing the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s. They had nowhere else to go. The walled city had no rules, no rent controls, no questions asked. You could build whatever you wanted. Stack rooms on top of rooms. Run a business without permits. Exist outside the system. By the 1950s, the population was growing rapidly, and the building began in earnest. Here's where it gets interesting. Without any central planning, without any architects or engineers in charge, the residents of Kowloon walled city created their own construction logic. Buildings rose organically. One family would build a structure. Their neighbor would build against it. Then someone would add a floor on top. Then another. The buildings merged into each other. Walls became shared. Staircases connected different structures. What started as separate buildings became one massive interconnected organism. The height limit was around 14 stories. Not because of any regulation, but because that was as high as you could build without the structures collapsing. The residents figured this out through trial and error. When a building showed signs of stress, they stopped adding floors. It was engineering by intuition. The density was staggering. At its peak, Kowloon walled city housed approximately 50,000 people in an area about the size of 2 football fields. That's roughly 2 million people per square kilometer. For comparison, Manhattan has about 27,000 people per square kilometer. Kowloon walled city was almost 100 times denser. And yet, somehow, daily life functioned. Now, I need to be honest about something before we continue. Kowloon walled city wasn't a utopia. It had serious problems. Crime was rampant in the early years. Triads controlled many of the businesses. Drug use was widespread. The sanitation was questionable at best. But here's what's fascinating. Over time, the community developed its own solutions. Not perfect solutions, but solutions that worked well enough to sustain 50,000 people for decades. And understanding how they did it reveals something profound about human adaptability. Let's start with water. The city had no official water supply. The Hong Kong government refused to provide services to this legal gray zone. So residents dug wells. They collected rainwater. They ran unauthorized pipes from nearby mains. An informal network of water distribution emerged, maintained by residents who understood that everyone's survival depended on cooperation. Electricity was similar. The grid didn't officially extend into the walled city. So residents tapped into nearby power lines. They ran cables everywhere. The wiring was a chaotic mess that would give any safety inspector a heart attack. But it worked. People had lights. They had refrigerators. They had televisions. The Postal Service is perhaps the most remarkable example. The Hong Kong Post Office refused to deliver inside the walled city. So residents created their own system. They established unofficial addresses. They designated collection points. Mail would arrive at the edge of the city, and a network of residents would distribute it internally. Everyone knew everyone. Letters found their way. This is what happens when government abandons a community. The community doesn't disappear. It adapts. It creates parallel systems. It finds ways to meet basic needs through cooperation and informal organization. The internal layout of Kowloon Walled City was like nothing else on Earth. The streets, if you could call them that, were narrow passages between buildings. Some were wide enough for two people to pass. Others required turning sideways. As buildings grew taller and merged together, the lower levels became permanently dark. Residents called it the City of Darkness. Sunlight only reached the rooftops. So that's where much of the community life happened. Children played on the roofs. Families grew vegetables in makeshift gardens. People exercised, socialized, hung laundry. The rooftop became the public square that the streets couldn't be. Inside, the buildings were a three-dimensional maze. Staircases led to other staircases. Corridors connected to other corridors. Dead ends everywhere. If you didn't know the city, you would get lost within minutes. But residents navigated it effortlessly. They had mental maps built over years of daily life. The economy was equally organic. Kowloon Walled City became famous for certain industries. Unlicensed dentists were everywhere. They charged less than legitimate dentists in Hong Kong and asked no questions. Many Hong Kong residents actually came into the walled city for cheap dental work. There were also food processing factories. Fish balls, noodles, dumplings. The lack of health inspections made some people nervous. But the products were cheap, and the factories employed hundreds of residents. And yes, there was crime. The triads ran gambling operations, drug dens, and prostitution rings. In the early decades, they effectively governed much of the city through intimidation. But even this evolved over time. By the 1970s and 80s, the Hong Kong police began making limited incursions into the walled city. Not to take control, but to establish some minimal order. The most violent criminals were pushed out. The triads shifted to less visible operations. A strange equilibrium emerged. Residents described this period as surprisingly peaceful. Yes, there were illegal businesses. Yes, the buildings were fire hazards. Yes, the sanitation was poor. But people looked out for each other. Neighbors knew neighbors. There was a sense of community that many modern cities lack entirely. This brings us to the central question. Was Kowloon Walled City a failure of urban planning or an alternative to it? The traditional view is that it was a humanitarian disaster, a place of poverty, crime, and exploitation that should never have been allowed to exist. And there's truth to this. People lived in genuinely difficult conditions. The lack of sunlight, the cramped spaces, the constant noise, the fire risk. But there's another perspective, one that sees Kowloon Walled City as proof that communities can self-organize, that people don't need architects and planners to create functional living spaces, that given freedom, humans will figure out solutions that no top-down design would ever produce. The reality is probably somewhere in between. Kowloon Walled City worked as well as it did not because of anarchy, but because of organic organization. Rules existed. They just weren't written down. Norms emerged through daily interaction. Bad actors were identified and dealt with through social pressure. It was chaos with hidden order. A system that looked like madness from outside, but made sense to those who lived within it. In 1987, the Hong Kong and Chinese governments finally agreed to demolish Kowloon Walled City. The residents were compensated and relocated. The demolition began in 1993 and took until 1994. Some residents were relieved. They moved into modern apartments with proper plumbing and legal electricity. They had windows that let in sunlight. They had addresses that mail carriers recognized. Others mourned. They had lost not just their homes, but their community. The social networks built over decades couldn't be relocated. The neighbors who had shared walls for 30 years were scattered across Hong Kong. The informal economy that had sustained thousands of families evaporated overnight. Today, the site is Kowloon Walled City Park. It's designed in the style of a classical Chinese garden. There's a museum with photographs and artifacts. Sections of the original foundation are preserved under glass. Tourists visit. They look at the photos of the incredible density. They marvel at the architectural impossibility of it all. And then they leave, returning to a Hong Kong that is itself one of the densest cities on Earth. But nothing like what the walled city was. So what can we learn from Kowloon Walled City? First, that density itself isn't the problem. 50,000 people lived in conditions that would seem impossible. And while their quality of life wasn't ideal, they survived. They worked. They raised families. They built communities. The human capacity for adaptation is extraordinary. Second, that informal systems can be remarkably effective. The water distribution, the mail delivery, the internal navigation, all of these emerged without central planning. When people have to solve problems to survive, they solve them. Third, that community matters more than infrastructure. What made Kowloon Walled City livable wasn't the buildings. It was the relationships between people, the mutual aid, the shared understanding, the neighbors who would watch your children or lend you rice when you ran out. And fourth, that we should be humble about urban planning. The professionals who design our cities assume they know best. But Kowloon Walled City suggests that sometimes the best solutions come from the people who actually have to live with them. This doesn't mean we should abandon building codes or let everyone construct whatever they want. The walled city had real problems that proper planning could have prevented. But it does mean we should listen more to communities, understand how people actually use spaces, recognize that the messiness of organic development sometimes produces better results than the cleanliness of master plans. Kowloon Walled City is gone now. It exists only in photographs, documentaries, and the memories of those who live there. But its lessons remain about human resilience, about the limits of control, about what happens when 50,000 people decide to build a world together, one room at a time. If you want to explore more hidden stories of urban design, stick around. I'll see you in the next one.